So my name is Sammy Chong, and I am a citizen from Ecuador. Right now, I've been hired as a full-time faculty to teach studio art here in Boston College. And this experience of being Latin American / Chinese in the United States has been very interesting because one way or another is affecting or is present in my art making, in the subject matters that I depict, and also in the concepts that I tackled in my work. But it's also interesting for me, at least as I look back, that even though I was raised in Ecuador, but because of my Chinese background, even back in Ecuador, I always felt like almost like an outsider. So since I can remember, since I'm a child, I always have felt like an immigrant or somebody who is really dealing with issues of identity. In my recent body of work that I showed at Pelham Art Center, which I called the 12th, the subjects or the protagonists of this body of work were all immigrants. And as I did my research, the images that I came about is depicting the immigrants performing jobs that are linked to sort of the stereotype. For example, at least here in the Northeast, or at least in Boston, I learned that, for example, housekeepers or housemaids are most of the times Brazilians or Portuguese, or, for example, landscapers are Latin Americans. That maybe Chinese immigrants are working in small kitchens or takeout places and so forth. So I really wanted to grab that situation and give form to these people who most of the times are invisible. So my goal was to give form to maybe the faceless or the voiceless. As I also was working in early stages of these paintings, I found out that each one of the immigrants, and that's again coming from my own experience as an immigrant, we have rich backgrounds and historic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, tradition that is most of the times overseen or is pretty much, or could be overseen or disregarded. And yet immigrants, they bring not only a different point of view about life, but they bring also religious beliefs, political points of view. They bring color, flavor to what has been traditionally seen, at least my understanding of the United States, as a melting pot, bring their own, almost like a thread to this beautiful, what could be a beautiful tapestry. I really like the idea that as we put together the different colors, threads on fabric, the result is something that is beautiful and that is and something which many people can enjoy. So that's what I want to do. I wanted to do with this body of work at Pelham, is to pretty much celebrate diversity, celebrate all these individuals that, as I said before, most of the times are invisible. As I did my research on each one of these cultures, I really want to portray them doing, performing their jobs with dignity. But instead of painting their heads, the portraits of these people, I want to use a mask. I want to use or a headset that belongs to their own traditions, to their own religious beliefs that is charged with meaning. Those masks are usually mythical or divine masks that has power that goes beyond the physical realm. And for example, when I was working on the Brazilian piece, this in which we see this lady on her knees cleaning a toilet, very humble, very menial, and she is using this mask or this headset that in Brazilian culture evokes this deity of Iemanjá. And what I found fascinating is that in the Yoruba tradition, that Iemanjá is the view or is the interpretation of the Virgin Mary through the Yoruba filter. And in that syncretism is something that really caught my attention, because again, all these traditions we may see, but we do not understand those symbols, and they have so much meaning in their own culture. And therefore, as I was doing my research, I learned, and I felt like it would be great if the viewer, as he or she sees these different characters with the different masks from different religious or mythical backgrounds, the viewer might be enriched and might learn hopefully something about this individual, these immigrants. Another one, and this something that is comes from really South America. I mean, in Ecuador, we have a very also heavy, the Incas were the Aboriginal culture that eventually was overtaken by the conquistadores, by the Spaniards. So, but I wanted to rescue that tradition, that visual, the visual tradition that now is could be seen in museums, anthropological museums. And for the landscaper who is from South America, I depicted, for example, I chose the god sun, or the god who is a creator, and his name is Inti. All right, and as I was painting creating this body of work, I just came to realize that in different cultures, different times, in different traditions, these gods or goddesses are usually related to something that is about creation or about fortune, about nature, connected to the earth, and given the situation of our times, what's going on today, I felt that it's very compelling to go back to the roots, to what is maybe basic, that is grounded in the deepest corners of our psyche, which is we are individuals that belong to the earth, and we should be at ease or be able to coexist in peace with nature. In addition to the idea of using, or with the technique of using this kind of surreal approach by using masks, imposing them on my protagonists, I used a collage in the background of my pieces, a collage of images that have that vintage look, as if those pictures are taken from family albums. And on each painting, the background is formed by a collage of black and white vignettes of folk traditions, traditional dishes, traditional folk outfits, but also of people who are important within that culture, leaders or heroes, athletes, and so forth. And if the viewer has the time, it could just spend, my invitation would be to really figure out what the collage is informing to the overall piece. Because in the end, what I do want to create is these multidimensional layers of understanding that hopefully the viewer will take in little by little. And by multidimensional, I mean that if my, for example, what is the figure or what is in the foreground is my protagonist or the immigrant that I'm depicting, I paint with a very vibrant, almost flat technique that somehow contradicts the more naturalistic or realistic collage of pictures that sit in the background. So that contradiction hopefully will raise questions or will allow the viewer to ask questions about what is going on here between the figure and ground. Why is the background sometimes muted and the foreground is so vibrant and so forth? And that's part of the some of the formal aspects that I most of the times use in my work, creating tension by these multiple layers of information that I depict or draw in the same image. In the past, for my thesis at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, for my final thesis, I created this body of work using plexiglass, wall installations that are created by using multiple layers of plexiglass. And in that moment, I used the plexiglass almost like a metaphor of all these obstacles or all these layers that mediate our human relationships. And plexiglass is found in many common places, in the mall or as we walk the street. Plexiglass is everywhere. So I wanted to use the medium as the vehicle or as the vehicle that carries on the concept. In this case, is how do we interact with one another. And after I worked with plexiglass, then I decided to, for example, use the printer to create these collages that I mentioned before. Because in this case, the collages, when I developed this body of work inspired in the life of Ignatius of Loyola, whom I wanted to depict almost as a contemporary hero. I used, in the background, I used these etchings created by Rubens in the 16th century. So in that case, I wanted to bring forth the conversation about the past in the present, but towards the future, using a technique that is so traditional as etching, but then mixing it up with a more modern approaches in painting. And what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that in my art practice, I am very respectful and mindful of the past, of the tradition, of the visual media, visual arts. But I'm also very aware that I am a citizen of the 21st century and that I want to appeal to the contemporary viewer. Therefore, I do admire artists that manage both the tradition and then they project that tradition towards the future. For example, I admire the work of Jenny Saville or John Curring. And recently, I've been very attracted by the work of Kehinde Wiley. And there are many others, but these are the ones that I've been looking at recently because they look at the past, especially it could be Renaissance, and then they are using those techniques to address issues that are relevant today. And as I address the idea of modern or contemporary artists touching base with master painters, one of the artists that really has informed my art practice belong to this art movement, or this, which is known as Baroque. And Baroque has been present in my life since I'm a little, because I was raised, or what I remember when my parents took me to church, as Latin America is still a very strong Christian Catholic continent. So I remember these Baroque churches with wonderful architecture and gold leaf and these magnificent columns, but especially the paintings really struck me deep, as I remember spending time sometimes in awe or fear by looking at depictions of hell, but also with hope as I contemplated also images, depictions of heaven. So that idea of almost opposites, light and darkness, salvation and damnation, is a concept that is really present in my work. And as I did more research, eventually as I studied art history, and I began to learn about Caravaggio, or especially Zurbarán, all these painters in which go beyond Baroque they are called the Tenebrists, as their images really come to life almost from the very dark, saturated dark background. And that extreme playfulness between lights and shadows, which for many scholars, and I guess it was Da Vinci who said that playfulness, or that all this depiction of light and darkness, are almost work as a metaphor of the light and darkness of the soul. That is what I tackle in my work, and therefore I'm not afraid of depicting subject matters that are not beautiful, depicting themes that may be just too pedestrian. And I bring this to the conversation because, for example, for the series of drawings that I made of the Minotaur, again inspired by Greek mythology, that I'm so attracted to because of that drama performed or unveiled by gods and goddesses, and all these almost like a soap opera in Greek mythology. So that information, or that imagery, I used to touch on or depict subjects that, as I said before, that most of the times are really overseen, or that are in dark spaces, or that are not that are voiceless. So the idea that the Baroque images are so striking because of the light and darkness, because of that drama, those concepts, or that aesthetic approach is an angle that I want to use in my work: light and darkness and drama. And that drama is being explored in my recent paintings, but also I explored in the drawings that I made of the Minotaur. I wanted to use this monster almost to carry on this idea that, even though by the status quo could be seen as a dark creature, as a monster, almost like a villain, and yet there could be also light as we understand this creature. When I was developing this body of work based on the Minotaur, I was inspired by Jorge Luis Borges' short essay, or it's a short piece about Asterion, and he does the name of the Minotaur, Asterion. And what struck me was that Borges depicts the monster as if he's unaware that he is such a despicable creature for others. And what was important to me in that story is that the monster, the essence of the monster, is not something that is essential to the Minotaur, rather is imposed by the mainstream, by the outside world, the outside world. And in the end, in the story, at least in Borges, the Minotaur will find light when he lets himself be killed by Theseus. In the end, there is freedom in death. Very dark, but again, it's that coexistence of light and darkness, and as I said before, salvation and damnation, and life and death that is really one of the leitmotifs of my work. Whether maybe not literally, is definitely always there. It's always there. So when I was working on that body, developing that series of drawings, I had to ask the question: who is the Minotaur today? Who are the monsters today? And my intuition told me that those monsters are those individuals who have been, in some cases, violently subdued or silenced by society. Those who have been forgiven, those who have been, or maybe just misunderstood because they are different. And therefore, I depicted this Minotaur as a drug addict, or as a prostitute, or as somebody who is in prison. And in each one of them, I used a technique almost as photorealism, even though these drawings are made with graphite, something that is so humble and so unpretentious. I wanted to use the medium almost as to give voice, critical voice, to a situation of recognition of the dignity of these quote unquote, or these misconceived monsters. So currently, I'm working in my studio in Jamaica Plain. I'm working in continuing or finishing. I don't want to call it a body of work. I mean, the 12 is still a work in progress. It's a work in progress because there are other menial jobs that I would like to explore. What I do, I'm very aware in my art practice, however, is not to get stuck in just the same style. Rather, always to kind of tweak and improve the visual language as I move from one piece to another. And especially, I really would like to keep exploring abstraction in figuration, but my abstraction is represented as I see my work evolving, as my images get flatter and flatter. So instead of trying to render figures to convey these luscious three-dimensional aspects or features of reality, I really in my process, I'm moving towards a more kind of flat to the language, to the language, and again, what is underneath this idea of as I move towards flatness? Yes, in the history of art, in the history of the 21st century, art is being explored in different ways, especially pop art comes to mind. But in my art appreciation, the idea of moving towards flatness is rooted more in the Orthodox or the Byzantine icon. Why? Because I really appreciate how in iconography, that flatness, the idea of almost forcing the viewer to admire the flatness of the surface that is also representing the flatness of the figure, makes the object depicted otherworldly, makes the icon to become a window to a more secret or divine world. Obviously, I don't pretend my paintings to become a window or a door towards the transcendence in itself. And yet the idea that flatness, that contradiction, something that I mentioned before in my work, as I as I move in towards these flat surfaces, I do want the viewer to inquire or to wonder if that what is depicted is just what it is, or if there is something else, if there isn't a possibility to transcend the object or the image or the piece of art. And I want to, in this regard, I want to address another vein that influences my work, and this coming from philosophy, from Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who believes that in his book, The Ethics of Authenticity, he claims that modernity has created the idea of individualism as a mantra and overachieving that is self-contained, but there is no room for common goals or for common purposes. And Charles Taylor believes that to be authentic is to be open to these larger contexts in which we operate, such as the environment or the community or society. All right? And he calls these larger contexts horizons of significance. Why I'm talking about this now? Because when I was mentioning the idea of icons and the idea of flatness, I do hope that the viewer, or we as a human beings, period, and not necessarily through my own work, but I do, in this case, why do I make art? Is because I do want to create venues to address these horizons of significance. Is who is the other? Who are we as human beings? Sometimes I've been, in the past, I have used mythological creatures like the Minotaur. I have used more religious or kind of archetypal figures, heroes like St. Ignatius of Loyola. Right now I'm using my experience as an immigrant, but also depicting other immigrants. But my goal really as a human being, but as an artist, is to bring forth this idea of these horizons of significance, meaning that we should be supposed to be so focused on our own selves, being able to bridge and to reach the other, and the other that could be sitting across the aisle in the subway or the bus, or that on the other, capital other, whatever, depending on the tradition, could be Mohammed, Allah, God, Buddha, all right, the other, but also the other as Mother Nature. And I know that this might not be totally explicit in my work, but those are my hopes. Those are my hopes, and that's why I make art.